Well, particularly after that build-up, I'm greatly honoured by the invitation to speak on this occasion. In the slot kindly given to me by the organisers to talk about international cooperation, there's not even time to just list all the programmes that have been the product of some form of international cooperation. In any case, most of you know more than I do about many of the sounding rocket, satellite and launcher programs which have contributed to the spectacular success that's been made. And I'm afraid there isn't time either to pay tribute to many of the pioneers, some of whom we've just seen, from all parts of the world, without whose efforts and sacrifices little would have been possible. And so, with regrets, no inventory of programs, no list of heroes, and not even a few slides. So, fasten your seatbelts. This is an occasion where one can slip very easily into understandable self-congratulation. And indeed, what has been achieved over the past 50 years certainly deserves congratulations of the highest order. But I will ask you to take that as having been said, and to indulge me by allowing this short time to be used for a very personal view of some of the reasons, both for our successes in international cooperation and for some of our less glorious moments. And I hope these reflections you will find relevant to our future cooperative efforts. You know, the word space is commonly used now to embrace the whole gamut of human activities which has developed around rockets and satellites. But it's, however, no longer adequate for anything more than superficial comment. And for any even halfway serious analysis, one needs to differentiate between the various sectors, the scientific satellites, telecommunication satellites, etc. And then superimposed over these sectors are the differences introduced by funding from private as opposed to public sources. And of course, a further complicating factor is the omnipresence of military or defence space programs, some of which benefit from international cooperation, and where there have been some rather patchy moves towards dual-use development. The whole makes a very complex area of human activity, and it could be argued that the word space has lost much of its utility as a classifier. Let me therefore briefly look at the different sectors. I'm going to start with scientific satellites, not because I've been bribed by my colleagues from COSPAR and ICSU, but because our scientific friends in most parts of the world were the major drivers for developing space activities, and certainly for international cooperation. And we in Europe owe a lot to a few fanatics who persuaded politicians at a very difficult time that it was worth putting government money into their scientific projects, at first by financing them to be hitchhiking their experiments on board other people's satellites, and later through the development of Europe's own satellites. The space science community, or perhaps one should say communities, because they're not all quite as monolithic as one would hope. They've managed virtually everywhere to secure a modest but regular share of available government funding. And I don't need to remind you of the breathtaking successes that have been achieved, many of them through international cooperation. I suppose apart from the absence of the dependence on private sector funding, one of the secrets of the space scientists' success has been their ability to organize themselves to convince governments and other controllers of purse strings that their results would not jeopardize national, commercial, or other interests. Provided they're not too expensive in the future, these same characteristics should enable scientific programs, particularly those involving international cooperation, to continue to flourish and profit from technological developments largely paid for by other sectors of the space domain. Always provided that government funding for them is not eroded by the appetites of the mammoth manned and exploration programs that have appeared on the stage in the second half of the century we're looking at. The extensions from scientific satellites to manned space flights, space laboratories, exploration, all benefited from considerable international cooperation. Sometimes the cooperation has been offered more to help ensure continued national funding rather than any need or desire for foreign expertise or foreign financial contribution. But whatever the motive, we in Europe undoubtedly gained much, both our space agencies and the industry, and it made us able to take giant steps both in space technology and in the equally important art of managing large programs. Manned space programs and the more ambitious exploration programs, because of the large amounts of money involved, inevitably necessitate a strong political involvement, not only in the initial decision, but during the lifetime of the program. This in turn means that the programs often overshadow the more modest funding requirements of other space sectors, and they have on more than one occasion purloined funding for smaller, innocent cooperative programs. Armed with top-level, if not always very well-informed political support, these large programs do tend to push other candidates away from the funding table over an extended period, unfortunately. And moreover, because it's difficult for space agencies and industry to create and manage a political space project, they're not always conducted in the most efficient way. We see this phenomenon in current large multinational programs, where political pressures result in a proliferation of unwanted ground stations, wrangles over the nationality of program managers, thinly veiled duplication of work packages, and the like. You can all think of examples. And this is perhaps to some extent unavoidable, but if we're to expect a real exploitation of the techniques that we've acquired for the benefit of humankind, cooperative programs must be managed efficiently and with a minimum emphasis on national advantage, one at the expense of common good. One might have expected, though, there would have been a painless progression from the early scientific satellites to what were then called application satellites. The cynics of the time described application satellites as those that had some use, as opposed to scientific satellites, of course. There was, however, no great enthusiasm from the telecommunications community, nor in fact from the meteorologists. In Europe, there was at least a 4 or 5 year period where the space agencies had great difficulty in persuading the traditionalists that satellites could indeed help them achieve their objectives, and to ensure them, which they suspected, that we were not after their money simply to build new space toys to play with. But once persuaded, the telecommunications industry had no trouble whatsoever in finding the private capital to finance the explosion which we've witnessed over these past 20 or so years, with its inbuilt network of international cooperation in parallel with a fierce international competition. Although there's always a cry from industry for further government funding in advanced satellite telecommunications technology, the dominant role of the private sector guarantees that development will be supported mainly on the back of market demand. And this makes for a very healthy situation. The telecommunications sector is probably the only one in this very happy position. It remains to be seen whether navigation can follow the same pattern. The past decade has seen a rise in popularity, especially in Europe, of the industry will pay syndrome. In space programs, this appeared in several guises, such as public-private partnership, but the basic idea is always the same. Industry is going to make a profit, and therefore industry should make some investment. Unfortunately, it's sometimes applied where the putative profit is not immediately apparent to the private sector, and the ensuing protracted negotiations never fail to produce debilitating delays and uncertainties. Like the alcohol advertisements are now obliged to say, this elegant solution to governmental cash shortages should be used with discretion. The sudden increase in telecommunications satellites obviously required an expansion of launcher availability. The launch vehicle sector has not, until very recently, been noted for its international cooperation, partly but not wholly because of defence interests, and there was no inclination to share technology across frontiers to form joint ventures. And progressively, all the major space nations became convinced of the need for independent launch capability, and they started to develop, as we've seen, their own national and regional vehicles. This required, and still requires today, governmental funding. Looking at the present launcher availability throughout the world, it's not surprising that some nations have decided that they can rely on the market to provide their launches. But the School of Independent Launch Capability still has many members. And once again, the sector of defence plays an important role. Thus, the well-being of the launcher industry in the future depends on a blend of finding sufficient clients, both domestically and in the international highly competitive market, and of persuading governments to continue to invest in further launcher development. I suppose we can call this a kind of semi-commercialization, with the development of cheap, reusable launchers still waiting to take off, if you'll forgive the expression. Tempting though it may be for developing countries to boast of having their own launch capability, seen purely from a civil perspective, it can only become an extremely expensive prestige symbol. Before leaving launches, I should perhaps offer some word to the aficionados of space tourism, which Arthur Clarke has mentioned. There are, of course, several new cooperative configurations which have started to emerge, but my personal feeling is that this activity has to find its own level, balancing the development and other costs against the willingness of clients to pay for the service. And it will develop at its own pace, and maybe in time it will bring some rewards in the form of cheaper launch solutions, but it isn't an area that would have my vote as priority for government expenditure. Although the entrepreneurs are certainly going to need some government help in removing legal obstacles, as we heard from Eileen a little while ago. Now, returning briefly to application satellites, after initial doubts, our meteorologist friends were able to develop in a direction which is perhaps more interesting to us than the cutthroat competition in the telecommunications and in the launcher fields. Based on a long tradition of public service, nationally, regionally, and internationally, the meteorological community was able to adapt to the use of satellites and to obtain the necessary budgets to do so. In many ways, it can be really cited as an admirable example of how space techniques can be transferred out of the classical space agency arena to provide sustained benefits for the world at large. Indeed, the data which these METSATs provide worldwide benefits users way beyond the traditional meteorological services. The only cloud on the horizon, so to say, is the need to avoid unnecessary duplication with the capacities which space agencies already have. And this requires close collaboration between the meteorological agencies at all levels and the space agencies. This is still not always the case. Otherwise, the Earth observation sector has had a very slow start. 30 years ago, chief executives were fond of decorating their offices with images from Earth observation satellites. Optimists amongst us saw this as the next area for commercial expansion, and I'm afraid we're still waiting for that. The technical competence is by no means lacking, and there is daily proof of the need for the data which can be provided from space. It's true there have been some valuable cooperations in this field, but they've in many cases lacked a global approach, and above all, they didn't address the basic need for operational systems. The initiative to create the Group on Earth Observations, GEO, was for that reason widely welcomed, because it was seen as a means of giving political support to cooperative efforts in Earth observation. Above all, it was heralded as the only way to ensure transition from the research satellites to the creation of global operational systems. Now, this isn't the time or the place to pass judgment on GEO, but I think it's relevant to our today's topic to stress once again that successful international cooperation in space programs, especially those which are intended to be operational and self-sustaining, requires solid and sustained political will and an ability on the part of governmental representatives to pursue the big picture and not to seek at every stage to ensure minor advantage for their national masters. In other words, we've moved from the era of cooperation between space agencies with a more or less indirect support from governments to an area where the critical path passes through international governmental agreements, with the space agencies playing a supporting role. One needs constantly to bear in mind that most decisions on the funding of large programs have very little to do with the merits of the space program as such. Particularly where there's a possibility of international cooperation, the predominant factors are inevitably political. Advantage therefore goes to the sectors where the users are the best organized. Many of the users and uses of Earth observation fall into the black hole known as public good, and this has never been a good recipe for finding funding campaigns. I'm sure my old friend Kasturi Rangan will have more to say about international cooperation in the field of Earth observation, but I'm especially happy to see him here today because India is the best example of how a space agency has had the intelligence, almost from the outset, to make allies of the various ministries which stood to gain from the development of India's space program. This national realization of the value of space, tailoring objectives of the space program to meet the wider needs of the nation and not the needs of the space agency. This is precisely what is needed now at an international level in order to create a committed and multifaceted user community for Earth observation. Because utilization is spread over so many areas, in some of which there is no existing user community, space has lost most of its ability to speak with a single authoritative voice. Funding is distributed nationally and internationally between the various space sectors according to national priorities, national political pressures, and we're a very long way from having a balanced set of international cooperative programs. In most countries, the available funding for space is more or less stable, and there's little evidence of any enthusiasm for significantly increasing the overall amount. Because there's no common measuring stick, it's difficult to judge between, for example, spending money on determining whether there is or was water on Mars and an operational system addressing global climate change. The idea of an international space agency, as you know, has been around for a long time. It's never gained much support, and I continue to think that it wouldn't be the solution that we're now looking for. But there may be a case for a formally agreed but restricted international program arising naturally out of GEO, which could fund and maintain an operational EO system, always of course in close association with existing national and international programs and with the essential in situ data providers. We can point to many high-level international conferences over the years where noble calls have been made for increasing cooperation in areas which I think common sense indicates are priorities. But there's not really much to show for all this political activity. I would still like to put my faith in GEO, not in its present somewhat penny-pinching mode, but with the vision of really putting some money into making the global Earth observation system of systems work. And to achieve this, we're going to need the active support of international groupings that do have a say: ICSU, COSPA, IAF, CIOS, IGOS-P, and many others. And we shouldn't forget, as Gerard has reminded us, of COPAS, a much underrated institution, and it has a great part to play if only its delegates would stop to address the real issues. Suitable pressure by all of these organisations can help government to remember where the priorities in cooperative programmes ought to be. I expect I will have disappointed some listeners who wanted to hear stirring words about the next leap forward in space through increased international cooperation. But my heart really wouldn't be in it, you know. When one considers the marvels that have been achieved by cooperation in the past, it seems unthinkable that we can't find the right mechanism to harness our present impressive capability to the original cooperative, dare I say it, almost altruistic spirit which space engendered in order to address some of the problems facing humankind, which to me at least seem much more urgent and less expensive than some of the cooperative projects which are being put forward now. At this point in time, looking for an alternative to Earth where humankind can, so to say, start again, seems to me to be a rather weak excuse for not addressing what are literally urgent, down-to-earth problems. However, if you do in the next 50 years find a suitable planet for life, do please let me know. I'll be sure to leave a forwarding address. Many thanks for tolerating these thoughts. They're not in any way intended to disparage the achievements of the past 50 years of cooperation, but rather to encourage us to continue to cooperate in a more focused way. Thank you.